Beyond the forbidden.
To put the cart before the horse in this argument so people know where I'm going from a biblical perspective, serpent worship is the idea that human beings can attain immortality that was lost by Adam through their own means, not through God. All right, so if you go to Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, you will see that the Elohim, representative of the creator God, archetype, says that they have to shut up what's called the tree of life, because if they can access that, they will be like us, being immortal and such. All right, and this is why you get rhetorical societies, debating societies that operate on the concept of rhetoric. They teach rhetoric, which is really just another way of saying life is about persuading people. It's not about truth. It's about persuading them that you're right about something, irrespective of the truth. We see it in our justice system all the time, all around the world. And so that's why you get societies like Skull and Bones. They'll take 322. It's a reference to that point that supposedly God is the God of the Bible, the archetype God of the Bible, is admitting that humans can actually achieve immortality without God. They have the capacity to become their own immortal beings. And this is, again, a major aspect of the transhumanist move, the idea of moving into an androgynous, self-maintaining species that just needs maintenance but can live forever, just keeps re-downloading itself, and all these sorts of ideas. This is what goes back to what was suggested in the Garden of Eden to Adam and Eve. Why to be a god in your own right allows you to then seek a way towards immortality without reference to God's way of doing things. The ability to say, this is how it's going to be done, this is how it's not going to be done, and such, and I decide that. And of course, this idea of becoming immortal, when I talk about a death cult, people think it's all about death and so on. It's not. It's actually, it's a culture that's obsessed with immortality, which means they're obsessed with their own potential death and such. And they want to thwart death at the expense of everybody else so that they have an immortality. But serpent worship is one of the most profound and one of the most ancient. All right. And when you look at the biblical account, and we talk about a talking snake, that has always made people laugh, that the biblical account sort of seems a bit of a joke as a result. Michael Heiser, a scholar in Hebrew languages, he's very much of the opinion, and I agree with him 100%, that Eve was not approached by a snake as such. She was approached by a shining being. All right, think Illuminati, think about the illuminated ones that I talk about in my book, that kind of stuff. And it was this shining being that convinced her, you don't need God to be a god, to be immortal. You can be your own particular God in your own right, deciding for yourself what's right and wrong. So how does somebody enslave the human species? All right? And so my argument ultimately is that transgenderism, that transhumanism in its form, is that if the natural world or natural creation belongs to a creator God on a legal basis, whether you believe in that God or not, it's not important. But if you have that legal understanding, then if you can engineer a new species that is not part of that creation, and you can patent it, just like they're doing with seeds, just like they're doing with a lot of different biological concepts, then you have a legal basis for saying we own that species. So a human 2.0 re-engineered, transhumanized species of human is, I believe, it's ultimately their ultimate goal is to replace virtually the whole of the natural creation with a synthetic creation of which they can then rule legally as that synthetic creation's creator God. Nonetheless, you see where I'm. Eve is convinced that, in fact, eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is going to make her like a god, being able to decide what is right and wrong. And this is the biblical definition of what a god is. A god is that which decides what is right and wrong. All right. So in ancient Israel, when God was their king, it was the law that was king. In other words, the Israelites at Sinai actually formed a republic. That's what the definition of a republic, where law rules, where law is the king, not a human individual deciding for themselves what is right and wrong on the fly. And this is the basis for um, how evil came as well. A lot of people say, oh, it's a loss of innocence. No. The second that um, the God of the Old Testament told Adam and Eve, you can't eat of that tree, innocence was gone. They already knew they had a choice. They could either do it or they could not do it. They decided to go against the instruction, and it triggers a whole lot of events. And this is how the Hebrew mind understands what the cataclysm was all about, why there was so much death and destruction. It was because humans decided um, that they could act like a god in their own right, and contrary to divinely revealed ideas of what is right and wrong, they would decide what is right and wrong. Now, this is what mythology describes. Whether it's Nordic mythology, whether it's Greek, whether it's Egyptian, whether it's Hindu based, whether it's Chinese, they all point to this northern realm where we have the pole star today as being the seat of the original creator god, the abode of the gods. And this is what is so important to understand about what I'm presenting here as an explanation for why mythology can be used so effectively. Because once for nefarious reasons, because once you understand, have that key, that much of mythology is referring to things that happened up in that happened to the north, the celestial north, not the polar north, not the geographical north, but the celestial north of this planet. That things happened in the skies in that region that have become mythology, and that most of modern day interpretation of mythology sort of jimmies that out of the way in favor of trying to contrive this an interpretation with the modern day sun. Once you understand that mythology is talking about something that happened in those celestial northern regions, you have a rational understanding of what mythology is actually all about. You have a rational understanding of why there was a golden age, of why there was a silver age, and so on. And of course, this is why Saturn Death Cult starts with its cosmology in leading up to how that cosmology led to a mythology that's been distorted for nefarious reasons down to the day that we have today. And simply, we have forgotten what those skies were like, and we've now categorized mythology as just another form of fiction.
I've known about your research for a long time. Like I said, I thought it was before 2000. I think you said 11, 12 with
11,
Henrik.
yeah.
I thought it was before that. It seemed like it was you were one of the first ones. I was Red Ice Radio is probably my everybody else was mostly coast to coast. Mine was Red Ice, the old Red Ice, you know.
Yeah,
I
good show.
started I started following it back in 2006 or 7.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, anyways, so fast forward a few months ago, whenever Elon Musk he dropped his logo or his banner of the, basically Saturn, you know, that like you were the first one that I thought of. You know, you were
Mm-hmm.
literally, Troy, you were the first one I thought of out of all the researchers that have talked about it, but you basically have brought it to a different level over the years and you've added nuances to the conversation with this cult, with these ancient adepts, you know, and you tied basically these adepts into everything like pedophilia, um, everything that's happening today, you know. But first off, why why is it what is it with the symbolism first? You know,
Mm-hmm.
because you know it's clearly X, and you had that logo with it's like basically Saturn. You know, it's with but why is it blacked out? And I don't know what is it with these motifs and these the symbolic gestures with these with the symbolism. What is it actually? Why does it matter? You know what I mean? Like, why does it matter to these guys, to these players on the global stage?
Because they work, and it's because symbols function. They're driven by the archetypes behind them, the deep-seated psychological archetypes that Jung, the psychologist, explored in the early 20th century, and linked to mythology and various religions and so on, and the basic symbols that have come out of these archetypes. The primary archetype, of course, is the creator God archetype, the explanation for why humanity and the planet is here, so to speak. And then the secondary archetype that has the greatest effect on humanity is the doomsday archetype, the fear of a catastrophic event that could end us in terms of our lives and so on. And out of these archetypes, you get symbols that work on these archetypes. That cuts, there's the old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words and so on, but a symbol is worth 1,000 pictures. Jay Widener used to say that about symbols and such. And uh, the symbols that are particularly tied to Saturn mythology, and I should clarify for your audience, when I talk about Saturn mythology, it's really a generic term for the creator god mythologies that exist all over the world. There is the same type of mythological representation of this creator god archetype in virtually every culture. Anthropologists would always try to figure out how was it that one particular story related around this creator god archetype, this doomsday event and so on, was found in virtually every culture. And of course they came up with a diffusion theory that it was spread about, and it took on its own characteristics depending on the culture, the race, the clan, the families that took it on. I would posit a different uh, approach to that and say that the reason that the various cultures have virtually identical archetypes operating in their mythology, even though they have different names and different, slightly different narratives and so on, is because every culture saw the same thing at one point in the ancient times. And so modern comparative mythology can see that virtually every culture, whether it's Western, whether it's Mesoamerican, Chinese culture, Pacific Island culture, and so on, they all have this basic same story that is rooted in this creator god archetype, of which Saturn is the name that I use for convenience, but it applies to Kronos, it applies to it applies to Osiris, it applies to Quetzalcoatl, it applies to the Emperor of the North in Chinese culture, and so on. And this is why these symbols work. Is that at some point, and Jung, his role in all this was to identify that we as individuals share an almost corporate psyche issue with the rest of humanity, where we're affected by these archetypes, and symbols bring out that effect when they are used. So if you want to influence people, if you want to get the jump on your competitors, if you're in business, or just simply to come across as somebody that triggers an innate response in people, that somehow you know more, you are in charge, you have hidden knowledge, then these symbols have proved absolutely infallible in doing it. It's one of the reasons I always say to people, it's one of the reasons why you see these weird squiggles and symbols on the American dollar bill, along with their weird incantations in different languages. They're there for a reason. It's not because everybody speaks Latin and everybody is aware of these symbols. They just trigger things. And so once you know the origin of how symbolism came to being, the effect it has on the corporate psyche, kind of, people would call it a race memory of the species, that goes back to traumatic events. Once you know how these symbols trigger traumatic reactions to past trauma that the species as a whole has suffered, uh, it frees you from being, liable to being controlled by these symbols, by the acts of people who would use this for their own personal gain, for their own particular agendas that are exploitive of the general population as a whole.
Is it because they, like you said, there's power in these symbols,
Mm.
and they knew the power in these symbols, and that's why they want to keep that to them, and they tell us thou shalt not make any graven images, or it
True.
makes you wonder if there's a connection there,
Hmm.
that
Yeah,
don't.
there's always been a battle, because in the scheme of history that I present to people in my book, which has various chronology, there is a period of time called the Silver Age, which is the priestly time, and the period after a golden age, as in the way that poets like Hesiod, the Roman poet, talked about the ages of man, not the scientific ages of Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, that kind of progression. But what we're talking about is the esoteric mythological progressions of Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze, Heroic Age, and the current, what we apparently live in, according to this thinking, the current Iron Age of humanity. But in the Silver Age, that was a time when they had survived a massive cataclysm that had nearly wiped out the species. And there was a schism that happened between people who looked to try and find a way to preserve what was great about the golden age that preceded that cataclysm, when everything worked very well, and people have very fond memories of it. How to preserve what came out of that golden age and apply it to the new environment that the human species found itself in after this cataclysm. And as a result of that, you get the basic issues with how humans behave. Some people want to use that knowledge for good. Some people want to use it to exploit other people for the benefit of themselves. Something we can discuss later in terms of how that developed in the story. But that, in a nutshell, you've got that schism of how to apply what was great about the Golden Age, going between people who wanted to do it for good. I call that the Melchizedekian approach, which is biblically referenced to this priesthood that existed before the Israelite kingdoms and so on in the biblical record. But generally speaking, again, that's a generic term that I use for the kind of priesthoods that wanted to do the best thing, wanted humanity to thrive like it did in the Golden Age. And then you get these other um, splinter cells, or groups of people within these priesthoods who recognize that they have a tool that they can exploit for their own benefit. And ultimately, to cut to how it's relevant to today, what I do is I map out how these events in the past that are enshrined in mythology, that have their own cosmology that I present to people, ultimately ends up in a world where the dominant force for evil is what I call the central banking system of international debt-based finance. This is the methodology that's been refined over nearly 6,000 years, certainly last 5,000 years of human existence, as a means of enslaving people for the benefit of a small elite, a small group, in a world that suffers the problems of scarcity, uh, um, basically threats of that kind. And uh, it, this central banking system is that system that has control in today's world, and that's why I argue we're sort of on that precipice of people trying to realize a new golden age that mirrors the old golden age, but replaces the Saturn god archetype with humans who literally behave as if they are heirs to the authority of the original Saturn creator god archetype. And they plan to rule with the same power, i.e., decide whatever lifestyle or you know, whatever existence, whatever way that humans live, they will define and decide and enforce according to their own terms. And so essentially, my book is about two golden ages, one that was lost in a cataclysm that so affected the human psyche, and symbols and archetypes, symbols driven by archetypes can be used to exploit virtually every form of humanity on the planet, whatever race, tribe, nation of people, and so on. And it's all a build up to this idea that they want to launch a new golden age, but a man engineered golden age, that is on their terms, where they decide what the laws are, as opposed to the Melchizedekian approach was they felt they had divinely revealed laws and such that had operated in the golden age, and that's why it was a golden age. The Saturn creator god archetype is first and foremost a law-giving archetype. It's where you get your laws. The first law being how to calculate time. Saturn is the god of time, Chronos. That, or these sorts of links, and it's the laws that came out of that golden age that they tried to preserve that have been distorted through the use of symbolism, to allow people to have the basic idea. Yes, we are now in authority, and we will decide what's right and what is wrong, as opposed to what drove the golden age.
Well said. And you've talked about earlier a while ago, you mentioned doomsday, cataclysms, and things like that. But you've spoken about that for years,
Mm-hmm.
and how the fear of cataclysmic, or you talking about the doomsday archetype, and how the
Yeah,
fear of cataclysmic events has been used to
another one.
drive people towards irrational and self-destructive behaviors. Do you
Yeah.
think? I remember hearing you say, because I wrote that down. I didn't even have to look at an old podcast. I just remember that
Mhm.
from years ago that you talking about that.
Yeah.
So do you think that was and I still want to kind of go into the past, and kind of work our ways to the future, but do you think that doomsday archetype is what happened in 2020 and other things, with
Absolutely.
with it
Yeah.
with it with the jabernacle,
Mhm.
but the thing is, it's almost like it's rewriting the code within our very DNA or something, our genetic makeup, or
Yeah.
it's playing that on when our minds are off balance, you know, it's being tricked into believing something. It's like there's this constant influx,
Yeah.
in our subconscious minds, and
Mhm.
it does make us act irrational, and it makes us, I guess, unstable. I don't know if that's the
Mhm.
right word, unstable, because ultimately it just makes us more easily controlled and manipulated, and where we just keep moving forward or obeying the marching orders of these elites.
Well, what you're touching upon is the fight or flight, um, response that many humans have. And if you can trigger fight or flight, what you're doing is you are inducing people into a state of fear. And the doomsday archetype, the idea that we're under threat of being nearly wiped out again, this is what the doomsday archetype is essentially all about. It's based on, I would argue that mythology is actually the record of actual events that took place around about 6,000 years ago. Well, between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, and really only settled down about what we would call 500 BC. So only 2,500 years ago do we have the world and environment as we see it today, um, settling into how we see it today. And prior to that, the events that took place in the general cosmos and so on created such a fear of being wiped out, particularly the real the doomsday event that wiped out the golden age. That fear is what has been triggered of that returning. Now, on a religious basis, it's the idea of the Saturn god archetype has changed from being a beneficent god that brings life, brings light, brings laws, agriculture, all that, and then he changes on a dime and he becomes a very capricious killer of a god. That's where the symbolism of the scythe, and the sickle and so on comes with the Saturn god, creator god archetype. And as a result of what people assumed was that, and I can only put it in the easiest way to understand, One day, this Saturn god archetype, who had this lovely golden age going, got out of the wrong side of the bed and decided, I'm fed up with this, I'm starting again, and basically created a cataclysm as a result of what happened. This is the mythology behind the great doomsday events that we have in all the various mythologies. And as a result of that, the surviving humans no longer saw that particular god. Well, many of them no longer saw that particular god as beneficent towards them, as beneficial. They saw it as a capricious god that could do that again. And it is the threat of another doomsday event that triggers the greatest deep-seated fear in humans, whatever culture, whatever race, whatever tribe.
It's a way to keep this perpetual state within our subconscious minds. It's
fear.
like like a psychological servitude, you know.
Totally, totally. If you're fearful of your life and someone says, "I got a way that you can survive," you're going to listen to them. You may even start following what they're going to propose to you. And this is why this idea of of another cataclysm is so potent. A future cataclysm is so potent, a trigger, that can be used by people looking to control people towards whatever direction they want to move, particularly as a mass group. Individuals might, educate themselves and be able to not see be able to see what's being attempted. But generally speaking, they're not interested in individuals. They've always been able to destroy the individual who gets too much of an opposition. They're only interested in the way mass groups of people move. And as a result of this, this is one of the reasons why you will see in media, and I'm not just talking the modern media. You go back to Renaissance times, ancient times, and so on. All those all those things that they carved on walls or statues they made, they're all related to maintaining a mass thought that is subjugated by these archetypes that we're talking, and so these symbols act in the same way. And today, in the business culture and the international world of trade that we see that the successful companies are the ones who seem to be able to utilize these particular symbols related to this archetype of a god who has a reputation for being capricious. He can wipe you out, or you can find a way to influence him to say, don't wipe me out. I don't mind if you kill all that lot, but I've been good, so overlook me. And so a lot of the occult, nefarious aspects of what I would call the Saturn death cult, Saturn worship, and so on, has been geared to finding ways to make sure that they don't get taken down when the next big one comes. But over the years, as things have settled down and people have forgotten about the actual cataclysm and so on, they've realized that it's a wonderful exploitation of people to gain control over them if you can convince them that a cataclysm is coming, especially if you can actually engineer one. If you can create the environment where people are experiencing some sort of a cataclysm. This is why I say in the modern sort of version of the occult, they're not talking Nibiru or that sort of thing with planets arriving and wiping us out in a natural cataclysm anymore. It's all about plagues. It's all about biological weapons, nuclear weapons. It's all about financial catastrophes, which I think is one of the most important things that's there, because the financial side is quite literally the single greatest tool that they've developed for ensuring that we move in the directions they want us to go in.
And we will definitely touch a little bit on that also. But with these traumatic events, from the ancient times and earthly cataclysms, etc.
Mhm.
Well, before I get into this note that I wrote down, I think there's, I don't know what you could call it, some kind of dark, malevolent, demiurgic force. I don't know. I don't know. I think subconsciously these elites, these adepts, the Saturn death cult, other secret
Mhm.
ancient adult classes, adept classes, subconsciously or consciously, they've been guided, I feel like, by some type of dark malevolent force. Um, and that's the reason why that's why it seems like they're not human, even though they think they are. But from the ancient times through past traumatic events and earthly cataclysms, we collectively manifested some type of archetypal entity or dark malevolent force into our subconscious minds. And these traumatic events that we endured in ancient times allowed this dark force to harness our traumas as a food source, almost like we are the portals for these negative and dark forces to manifest into this reality. Maybe we were or are the incubator for this dark force to grow stronger and stronger over the centuries by buying into their fear and propaganda.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that in principle.
You could call it Lucifer, Satan, whatever, but something is guiding these individuals.
Yeah, I mean, one of the areas that I've been studying myself, personally, is the effect of what are called egregores, which are this idea, which is, it's essentially an idea which symbols will trigger, which archetypes will drive. Where you have ideas, it's ideas that are the driving force behind any form of malevolence or even beneficial outcomes. But
so we manifest so we can manifest this archetypal malevolent force into this world.
I do believe that there's the case that really the human capacity for creativity, for instance, has been mistakenly believed to be simply there in the brain, generated by the brain. Whereas what my understanding is that in the same way that you look at a television and you know that the television shows you watch are being broadcast over the air through a cable or whatever, they're not made in the television. So the human brain has some kind of connection to a greater, Rupert Sheldrake talks about morphic fields, the entirety of nature and so on. And that this connects all human beings in some way that, for us in our current state is very difficult for people to comprehend or to grasp and utilize, but is nonetheless there in the sense that we can all end up being affected. In other words, how do you explain that something that happened, by my reckoning, nearly 6,000 years ago, in terms of a cataclysm and so on, still affects us today, even though the world doesn't look anything like the descriptions of mythology that have been given to us? So much so that today's academia just cannot, to them, mythology in its original form is a madhouse. And so they create anthropomorphic narratives where they humanize the myths, so that when we're fed the myths of Greece and the myths of Rome and so on, these things have been refined into narratives, psychodrama narratives that the mind can understand as entertainment, as a story and such. They are nothing like the original descriptions of mythology that you get from the original languages and the original texts. And it's the reason that academia has done that is because to accept that the ancient mythologies may have had a place in reality is to accept that the ancients saw very different skies to the ones that we see today, that they experienced very different environments to the ones that we do today. And in the uniformitarian dominated world that we have, scientific world we have today, everything is about things changing slowly over time. The idea that the Earth could have been fundamentally different with a different sun, a different alignment with planets, and so on, as within human memory, let alone within the last 6,000 years, last 12,000 years, is incomprehensible to them when they look at the world around us and subscribe to the idea that the key to the past is what we see today. This is the fundamental difference between what people like me are proposing with Saturn theory and the cosmology we present to explain why mythology is so crazy, why they have had to, they've watered it down into soap operas, films that we can watch and sort of get ideas from in terms of human narrative, because it just simply doesn't describe a world that we can comprehend if we think that the world we have around us today has been this way for 4 billion years, and certainly throughout the experience of the human species.
Just for the newcomers, kind of
Mm.
give a Cliff Notes 101 version, no more than
Right.
5 minutes or so, because you kind of talked about it, the ancient skies back then. Because
Mm.
I know your research, but I do have a lot of newcomers to the scene, a lot of younger people, how, our sun wasn't always the sun we have now in the sky wasn't always our original sun, and Saturn used to be the sun. Kind of give a little Cliff Notes version of that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so you know, just what I was saying in the last part, the idea of modern academia today is to present mythology as almost like another variation of fairy tales. Okay, so in a cosmology that's based on the electric universe model of physics, in terms of how planets work, how the universe works, how stars works, and so on, like that, there is this idea that uh, we as a species lived on a planet that had an entirely different set of skies, to what we see today, in which the planet that we now call Saturn once loomed very large as a sun in its own right. The alchemists called it the best sun, and that every um, part of mythology where you see the word Saturn involved is this original sun god before the sun that we see today, as it is. And so what Saturn theory proposes is that mythology, far from being a form of fairy tales or psychodramas dreamed up for moral reasons or anything along those lines, is actually the written record of what they observed when the planet Saturn was captured by the sun, um, from its previous status as a free floating brown dwarf star. And it was a free floating brown dwarf star that had in tow at least two terrestrial moons or planets when it was captured by the solar system. And those two planets were Earth and Mars, Earth being the planet that we are on now. And so, what humanity lived through was a series of cosmological changes that saw them living under a brown dwarf star for a primordial period of time that we have no idea how far back it went. And then that primordial existence was broken by the capture of that brown dwarf star by the sun as we know it, which resulted in an entirely new environment taking place on the planet as a result of the way the brown dwarf star that would become Saturn, the planet, reacted to its capture, and such. And so they went through a process that I put it I put it at around about 14,000 10,000 years, um, of change that took place on the earth. That is the basis of the esoteric ideas of a golden age, a silver age, a bronze and a heroic age. And uh, so essentially putting it, the planet Saturn was once a brown dwarf star, free floating in interstellar space, and it was captured, drawn into the current solar system that we belong to now, and basically the Earth was part of Saturn's native orbiting planets or moons, if you would call it that way. And as a result of that capture, the the existence of Saturn and people on the Earth, we experienced an entirely new um, reworking of how things worked. Uh, Basically, we underwent a process by which the um, configuration of what we knew with our sun and the planets involved with that changed dramatically to the configuration that we now see today, where we have a heliocentric solar system. And it's that change that produced mythology, that produced the cataclysms, that produced everything that we see today that influences religion, and the occult. That series of cosmological events, that capture, is responsible for producing that body of work.
And do you think that's the reason why things have changed in the sky over the thousands of years? You know, we've gone from, you know, um, worshiping. We have lunar cults, you know, solar cults, and then Saturnian cults, you know, and then preparing for the show, then it made me think of. I remember Michael Desarian. I interviewed him back in 2010 a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Desarian, he mentioned something. Let me see if I can find it. So Michael Desarian, he discussed within his origins and oracles. I knew I found it somewhere. His astrotheology video. He mentions that the word Israel symbolically brings together three key deities and their associated cults: the lunar goddess Isis, who represents the lunar cult and the feminine, the sun god Ra, who represents the solar cult and the masculine, and the supreme deity El from the Saturnian cult. And then you have Israel, Israel, Isis,
Yeah.
Ra, and El. Are they coming together? Basically, what is he's saying? Converging their belief system, converging all their mythologies to create, for another term, you know, instead of Jacob's house of Israel, it could be just another house of Israel of different solar deities that these people worshiped back then.
Well, again, if you go back to sort of the original concept of the cosmology that I present in my book Saturn Death Cult to explain all this, because that's what I'm completely obligated to readers when I start talking about symbols and how they're used, to explain how this may have happened from a rational, even scientific sort of basis. As I say, I appeal to the electric universe idea of how the universe works on the physics level and such. But basically, when it comes to Saturn theory, which is this idea that Saturn, the planet, was once Earth's original sun, you encounter the problem that because of the uniformitarian approach to how people see the past as in what we see today, so much of what was Saturn, or the Saturn creator god archetype sun, was attributed to Sol, the sun that we see today in the sky. So you have a misidentification. So where you often hear people talking about Egypt being a sun worshipping people, you hear about all kinds of cultures that worship the sun. You hear about the lunar cults and so on. This is A lot of this is based on a rotten foundation of misidentifying that when these cults and these religions and these mythologies talked about the sun, they were talking about Saturn, all right, this original sun, not the sun that we see today. And if you assume it's the sun we see today, you run into all kinds of problems. You and it goes back to a guy called John J. O'Neill, the Victorian era academic, who simply looked at mythology and he understood that everything about sun worship in mythology is geared towards the polar north. It's not geared towards a sun rising in the east and setting in the west. It's geared towards the polar north. And he just could not see how this could be logical and so on. So he contrived to readjust what the mythologies were saying and reoriented it towards sun worship, as many people understand today, that big sun that we have in the sky today. And as a result of that, you end up with a very confused situation with regards to mythology, where so much of it just doesn't make sense. However, if you take the idea that the original sun that Earth existed under before the current sun, which is outrightly spoken about in mythologies. The Popol Vuh talks about, the old sun, not the sun of today, the one that we have today, and so on. They all point to the north, and I think, I always, in the interviews when explaining this concept, I always revert back to the best quote I ever found by Eduardo Cardona, one of the fathers of Saturn theory, a guy that I have a lot of respect for in terms of his cosmology and his research. And he said back in 1970, I think it was 1978, he claimed that the evidence of myth which points to Saturn having once occupied a position above Earth's north polar regions is voluminous. There is not a race on Earth that has not preserved at least one account which states as much. According to this evidence, Saturn occupied a central position in the north celestial regions. It rotated and rotated widely, but other than that, it was immovable. Now, this is what mythology describes. Whether it's Nordic mythology, whether it's Greek, whether it's Egyptian, whether it's Hindu based, whether it's Chinese, they all point to this northern realm where we have the pole star today as being the seat of the original creator god, the abode of the gods. And this is what is so important to understand about what I'm presenting here as an explanation for why mythology can be used so effectively. Because once for nefarious reasons, because once you understand, have that key, that much of mythology is referring to things that happened up in, that happened to the north, the celestial north, not the polar north, not the geographical north, but the celestial north of this planet, that things happened in the skies in that region that have become mythology, and that most of modern day interpretation of mythology sort of jimmies that out of the way in favor of trying to contrive this an interpretation with the modern day sun. Once you understand that mythology is talking about something that happened in those celestial northern regions, you have a rational understanding of what mythology is actually all about. You have a rational understanding of why there was a golden age, of why there was a silver age, and so on. And of course, this is why Saturn Death Cult starts with its cosmology in leading up to how that cosmology led to a mythology that's been distorted for nefarious reasons down to the day that we have today. And simply, we have forgotten what those skies were like, and we've now categorized mythology as just another form of fiction.
Doesn't to bring into the Bible a little bit, doesn't, of course, I know Christos means anointed one, Messiah, but does it have a connection also with Saturn? Because it's kind of okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you were actually one of the first back in the day to actually kind of, I thought, heard talk about that.
Yeah.
But you can go into that just a moment.
Mm-hmm.
So if Saturn, it was the original sun,
Mm-hmm.
and Christ is symbolically represented as Saturn, which was the original sun,
Mm-hmm.
and now we have the sun that we have now that dominates our skies.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the pretender god? Could that in the god? Could that be Lucifer? Could that be Satan? So are we ruled by the false god? You see what I'm saying? What I'm trying to bring to the picture here?
Yeah, I do. I would say no, fundamentally, that the conflict is in how we how we interpret the original Saturn creator god archetype. Remember, I was talking about a beneficent god, a beneficial god that brought life, brought light to the world, and then a god that turned capricious and destroyed the world,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah,
so on.
yeah.
And so you have that split down through religions, all right, where you have this capricious version of a creator god, which you find in much of modern day what a monotheistic religion, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and so on. They have variants of that. The God who would send you to hell, the God that uh, um, seeks retribution and so on, in terms of if you don't follow his laws, and this type of interpretation. But there is another interpretation, and so that other interpretation encompasses, do we see Christ, a later manifestation of that same archetype that came down, because Christ is identified by his followers as a manifestation of the order of Melchizedek. And that's why I talk about the Melchizedekian generic form of the priesthoods who would like to go back to a beneficial golden age, not go back to it, but to just simply have humans live in an existence where law is respected, and people have equal justice, rather than a society where we're all battling for greater influence over our fellow humans to get what we need and such. So there is that other interpretation that Christ represents the progression of those who sought to maintain what was important about the Golden Age. And as I say, the Golden Age wasn't just simply a time of paradise where, you could pluck whatever food you wanted from wherever, and eternal harvest. You never worried about any scarcity. It was a golden age because that's when humanity first really got introduced to the idea of weights and measures, laws. All right, the first weight and measure being the ability to calculate time, which is how the golden age was launched from its primordial, what I call the purple dawn of creation, where nobody could tell time. But once you can tell time, all the other measures, weights and the distances and aspects that control how we operate as a society, stem from that first ability to create time. In other words, we went from people who had to keep within literally shouting distance of our families to being able to organize with other families and say, let's meet on at this time. Let's all get together at this time, and let's agree that this is the amount of that constitutes a packet, or whatever measure or weight they were coming to. The ability to calculate time gave them that. So the Golden Age represents the burgeoning of civilization, and whether that civilization produces a civilization of justice, whereby people are going to do bad things no matter what. This is always recognized. But where justice is served and people can rely on justice to be equally applied, to whatever the talents of the individual, whatever their status in whatever society develops, they have to know that justice will be equally applied. Or you can go the other route, where you get a distortion of these weights and measures as defined by the Golden Age, which results in in people needing to bank up influence in order to get ahead of the other person in a competitive world that was caused by, and for people to understand this, the cataclysm brought about scarcity. As a result of the Great Cataclysm, the Earth went into seasonal changes. It never experienced that before, according to this cosmology. And those seasonal changes threatened starvation, because how do you grow stuff in winter, and so on, right? And so these laws and how they are applied means that do we have a world where you have a God of justice, or do we have a world where you have a God who seeks to be influenced by whoever has the better form of being able to influence? And the Christ figure is the latest manifestation of that battle. What do you want? Do you want a world in which you can rely on God to judge equally, or do you want a world in which we've got to battle for the extra bit of influence to get one over the people that we are in competition with? Christ is, in terms of the Saturn theory and so on, there is the other aspect of it, which is obviously the planet Jupiter came into play. The planet Jupiter was native to the sun, at least in relation to the people on Earth's experience when they were under Saturn. And it was Jupiter that actually knocked Saturn from its perch up in the north in terms of this cosmology that we're presenting. And it was that event that caused the great cataclysm and the destruction of the abode of the gods and so on. And for a while, Jupiter as a planet was actually our major celestial body. in the skies for a short time. And if you talk about Christ, Christ is more in lines with Jupiter. Jupiter is Zeus. Remember, Zeus kills his father and assumes, in the ancient mythologies, assumes the position of that which Saturn or Kronos had. And there is an element of that in the way Christianity is presented. But it comes down to one's own interpretation, and that is that are we simply talking about the reestablishment of a God, an archetypal creator God driven existence through people who respect justice and laws, or are we talking about a coup amongst the gods? Now, Saturn death cult people love the idea of a coup because they see themselves as killing God to replace God, to take that authority in terms of that archetype. So Jesus Christ can be interpreted as somebody as replacing the Father, all right, and all in one, and in the way that Zeus sort of came on the scene, or Jesus Christ can be interpreted as an attempt to steer us back into a justice-based world in which equal justice is how humanity lives. Now, there are lots of other aspects about Christianity that we can talk about in terms of its legal representation, but to put it simply, the Yahweh of the Old Testament is the Bible's Saturn creator God archetype. And Jesus Christ is the Zeus archetype that comes later. But there's a difference. There's either, this can either be a good thing or it can be a bad thing, depending on what your theology is.
I guess it's a two-part question.
Mhm.
Quickly, you do believe, and it's going to go along with what you were just talking about. You do believe Jesus Christ existed, correct?
I do believe that the human being, Jesus Christ, existed,
Okay.
yes. Oh,
I do.
Yeshua of Nazareth.
I do.
Yeah.
I do also. But
Mhm.
here's where, I don't know, double-edged sword or just the dichotomy or whatever
Mhm.
is what, when and how did these ancient solar cosmological events that actually took place,
Mhm.
when, how, and were they connected and tied into actual figures here on earth or representations of certain figures like Jesus Christ? And you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, sure.
why does it matter? Why do they do it like that? These adepts, why do they tie them into certain human figures with actual things that happened in the cosmological
Sure.
time frame?
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing that's always kind of confused me, Troy.
Well, this is something that I address in Saturn Death Cult when it comes to the Hebrew Bible, in terms of understanding how one interprets these cosmological events, which became the events of gods, according to most mythology, battles between gods and so on. That's stabilized world, and ultimately became represented by anthropomorphic forms of individuals, and ultimately um, were applied to living individuals in terms of how they affected people's religion. Now, what I'll say for people is that everybody who believes in a creator God archetype, i.e., that something created what we have, that it didn't come out about as an accident of evolution. If you believe in a creator God archetype, whatever that archetype form takes, that is your religion. Everything else is theology, all right, explaining how it goes. Now, what happened with the Hebrews? And this is best summed up when you look at the Gospel of John, which is a much later idea, but it concisely explains what the Hebrew mindset as opposed to the Greek mindset that was operating in how to understand what God is. In the book of John, you're told that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst men. I'm paraphrasing the actual quote for people who take that kind of thing seriously. Now, what that's telling you is that it's not in the beginning was an entity that gave a word. It's saying that the idea, logos, the word, was in fact the first cause that is God, and that that cause becomes manifest later in a human being that is called Jesus Christ. So when the Hebrews looked at what was going on with regards to cataclysms, and yes, their golden age is the Garden of Eden. The fall of the Garden of Eden is their cataclysm. It's the same as the fall of Atlantis, the fall of Olympus, all this sort of idea. It's the same concept all the way through. But the way that they understood cosmological uh, actions in the form of planets was not that they were gods, but that it was divine timing that maneuvered these celestial bodies to manifest God's will. Okay, so in the biblical sense, the Saturn creator God comes into the golden age with the famous statement, "Let there be light," the beginning of the supposed 6 days of creation. That you have that begins that golden age, that ends with the fall of Adam and Eve, in terms of how the Hebrew Bible puts it. But the Hebrew Bible was always about the power of God's mind, if you can call it that, the intellectuality of God, the idea, the words, the logos of God, to be able to set things in motion in such a way as they produce divine events. And somebody who comes into full understanding of how God's mind works, in other words, somebody who is able to think the same way as God in totality, is what is referred to as the Messiah in John became the word became flesh. And so Christ simply is the first human being who had the ability to see creation, to see the world through the eyes of that which created it in its totality, and not rebel, be in agreement with it, and so on. Now, the theology of that is that that initial force that brought creation into being is what manifested into the baby Jesus Christ. But the theology also has to portray Christ as a potentially fallible human being, affected with all the things that human beings would have, but overcomes all the problems that creation throws, or the environment of the world throws, by coming into perfect agreement with the word, with the idea, the original idea. And what is the original idea? The original idea is that creation is brought into existence, and there are ways in which you can interact with creation that are good, and there are ways that are bad. God has defined that, whoever you think it is, or what it is that is God, has defined the best way to get the best out of creation, and also the ways in which you will end up having negative consequences if you take that direction. This is what the fall is. This is what the whole story of the Bible is it's not the fall of creation, it's the fall of humankind within creation, and the subsequent march in time to bring humankind back into a stasis with creation, where they see the creation in the same eyes as that which created it, rather than its own eyes. And this is what makes the fundamental definition of evil from a Melchizedekian point of view. It's the sin of Eve. Eve says that in that day, if we take off the fruit, God says we'll die. No, we won't die. She's been convinced this by a shining one, the first adept, and we can get into who that was and so on. People think of it as a snake, but nonetheless, Eve is convinced that, in fact, eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is going to make her like a god, being able to decide what is right and wrong. And this is the biblical definition of what a god is. A god is that which decides what is right and wrong. All right. So in ancient Israel, when God was their king, It was the law that was king. In other words, the Israelites at Sinai actually formed a republic. That's what the definition of a republic, where law rules, where law is the king, not a human individual deciding for themselves what is right and wrong on the fly. And this is the basis for how evil came as well. A lot of people say, oh, it's a loss of innocence. No, the second that the God of the Old Testament told Adam and Eve, you can't eat of that tree, innocence was gone. They already knew they had a choice. They could either do it or they could not do it. They decided to go against the instruction, and it triggers a whole lot of events. And this is how the Hebrew mind understands what the cataclysm was all about, why there was so much death and destruction. It was because humans decided that they could act like a god in their own right, and contrary to divinely revealed ideas of what is right and wrong, they would decide what is right and wrong within their own right and live according to that. And this creator God had no business in doing that. Now, the Hebrew mind is saying that the cataclysm that happened, which was, I argue, planetary in nature and so on, is divine timing, because the all-knowing God would know that this is how the human species would ultimately start behaving. And so you end up in a series of events that launches the particular family that is behind the Hebrew Bible into a learning curve down through history, in which that learning curve gives them experiences and ultimately brings them into contact with a manifestation of a person within their ancestral line, in this case Jesus Christ, who is the perfect the person with perfect understanding of why God's ideas of what are right and wrong are the way to go, and not why mankind or humankind's ideas of right and wrong are the way to go. And I am somebody who believes that the Bible is never a world book. I do not subscribe to the idea that everybody came from Adam and Eve and so on like that. I don't think the Bible actually says that. When I say I don't subscribe to it, I'm saying the Bible doesn't say that. All right. It's a story about one particular group, their reaction to the cataclysm, and how their minds formed contracts with what they believe to be the first, these covenants, to be the first force of the creative force of the universe, in order to get back into equilibrium with how that first creator God force thinks. And the primary driving feature behind that is the drive towards justice, not towards influence and advantage, but towards justice. And that's why the concept of hell and these kinds of things is so at odds with that idea. It's a concept of a capricious retribution minded God, as opposed to a God that's trying to bring humanity through its own experience into an understanding of how to interact with a perfect creation he created. The Greeks, the Old Testament, the Genesis account says, God does this, and he created the world. He looked at it, he said it was good. The Greeks have a different idea. The Greeks always believed that creation was the source of their troubles, and that the best thing to do is to get the hell out of it somehow. This is the concept of heaven. You go to heaven. You get away from what the demiurge created, because that's evil. You need to become this concept of spiritual divorced from the physical created world. The Hebrew concept is entirely different to that. They were never about heaven and so on. It's been reinterpreted because of Greek influences over time, but they were about the idea of being resurrected into perfection at a time when creation and humanity are brought back into equilibrium.
It's hard to make it really simplistic. It's hard to make it elementary level.
Yeah.
But because it's so deep, but I would say you're on the forefront of any other researcher when it comes to these.
It's absolutely important to me, Michael, that one of the great things about con jobs is that they take a simple idea and they complicate it. And so when you're trying to explain why we've been living under vast con jobs of manipulation and so on, you have to deconstruct the complexity, bring it back to what it is and so on, um, uh, as it was originally portrayed. And once people have those fundamentals in terms of that have nothing to do with religion or theology or anything, they're just you know they have to do with seeing how things interact in a different way. Of course, the big thing is the crazy cosmology. How do people accept when we've been told that we formed out of a dust cloud that circled the sun for 5 billion years? What's all this talk about planets being captured and being ripped apart and their alignments being changed and all this kind of stuff? Your modern scientists, this is anathema to them, and they would just laugh it out. I don't recommend you approach your science tutor or professor if you're at university. I don't recommend you approach them with this stuff on the basis of trying to get a rational argument going. By that I mean a debate on it, because these people, their wages are dependent on the established paradigm of thinking, and this is such a massive threat. The idea that Saturn, Earth, Mars, Venus have only been in the solar system for the last 12,000 years is astounding, for most people. It's just beyond what they can comprehend. But for people who follow this kind of stuff, and the stuff that we're talking about, the stuff that I'm picking up you're most interested in, how it affects us at a spiritual, intellectual level. um, it's just it's another viewpoint. It's that Buddhist garden of viewpoints. You're just moving to another part of the garden, and it gives you a different view of what the garden has to offer you. And that's what shows like this give people.
So, man, I want to keep on kind of,
Mhm.
it all connects.
Mhm.
We're kind of talking about the past, the ancient past, cosmologically and historically. But I want to, and we can go back and forth the next 30 minutes or so, back and forth to the past, because I know it connects, but I do want to kind of bring it to modern day just a little bit.
Okay.
Um, well, first off, I had to ask you this because I really didn't want to mention, but I didn't know when I was going to bring it up. Let me just bring it up.
Mhm.
So, with the inauguration of Trump in January,
Mhm.
you have Melania's black cat, represents Saturn. You have
Mhm.
Trump's blonde hair, which represents the golden age. So
Mhm.
what the heck's going on here? Like, is this the return of Saturn's technocratic rule, Troy? Like Trump, Musk, and other technocratic elites in the
Yeah.
world, are they all on the same page knowingly or unknowingly, trying to bring
Yeah.
this new Saturn golden age back?
It's interesting because he's actually using the term golden age.
Yeah.
He's talking about America entering into a new golden age and so on. And for people who've listened to me and such, that would sort of trigger warnings. The new golden age is actually something to be a bit concerned about, depending on who's trying to launch it and such. But a golden age is not a bad thing intrinsically. It's a good thing to want to get back
I think the
to.
transhuman aspects of the golden age, I think, is the concerning parts of
It's the
it.
most dangerous part.
Yes.
It's because it's full on slavery, and I've recently written an article that I just find it. It's part of a book called Philomathy: Essays from the Frontiers of Inquiry. It just came out recently, but I wrote this about 5 years ago. It took a long time for it to be published. It's called Atlantis: Secret Societies and the Theft of Divine Sovereignty, and
Hmm.
essentially, I argue that belief, humanity's protection from slavery as such, is founded most effectively on the belief of a creator God archetype. Why? Because then what you're doing is you're saying that through the right of creation, humanity belongs to the creator God. Now, people will respond and say, oh, what, we're slaves to God. Yes, you are. But what that means is that you cannot be taken into slavery by any other human being without it being an illegal act of theft from that creator God. And so a creator God that protects you from being arbitrarily becoming the property of somebody else because you already belong to God is actually humanity's greatest bulwark, and always has been, against those who would enslave their fellow human beings. They can't do it. The most that they can actually claim is, we have a bill of sale from the creator God that sold you to us. But how do they do that? This is where you get the distortions in modern monotheistic religions. We're the guys who speak for God, and therefore we own you because God owns you. Whether it's the priests, kings, the popes, the imams, the various manifestations of people who take that carnal idea of what a creator God is about. But generally speaking, if you take the Ten Commandments, and people say, why didn't God say, thou shalt not, have slaves, and so on, okay? It is there. It's called thou shalt not steal. So your fellow human being is, according to this concept, this legal concept, is not for sale, and therefore belongs to somebody else. But if that fellow human being, the Hebrew concept of slavery was never chattel slavery. It was always about, if you go and steal something from another human being, then you have to pay back what you stole. And so if you couldn't pay back out of your pocket, you were put into what was called restitutional bondage. And that is the only slavery that is allowed by Old Testament concepts, that is legal in terms of human beings putting other human beings in bondage. We actually practice that. Prisons are a form of that. It's just that the people who are victims of the crimes of the people who go to prison never see any form of restitution for themselves. Whatever they do in terms of work goes to the state and is owned by the state, and so on. So that's completely different to how the ancients saw restitutional slavery. But the idea of chattel slavery, that was practiced with the transatlantic slave trade, with the Romans, with the various, all around the world. Cracky, the Comanche Indians practiced slavery of this kind, and such like that. That cannot be, that cannot ever stand legally if one believes in a creator God responsible for all creation, of which humanity is a part of that. So how does somebody enslave the human species? Right? And so my argument ultimately is that transgenderism, that transhumanism in its form, is that if the natural world or natural creation belongs to a creator God on a legal basis, whether you believe in that God or not, it's not important. But if you have that legal understanding, then if you can engineer a new species that is not part of that creation, and you can patent it, just like they're doing with seeds, just like they're doing with a lot of different biological concepts, then you have a legal basis for saying we own that species. So a human 2.0 re-engineered, transhumanized species of human is, I believe, it's ultimately their ultimate goal is to replace virtually the whole of the natural creation with a synthetic creation, of which they can then rule legally as that synthetic creation's creator God. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yes.
And this
Yes.
is why transhumanism is probably the most disgusting attempt. It's bad enough with debt-based finance. It's bad enough with outright slavery. Look, you're a slave because I say so. That kind of stuff. It's bad enough with all these religions that have claimed we speak for God and therefore you are our slaves. And all these priests, kings, and so on like that down through the ages that people have rebelled against. But this is the most insidious form, because what they're actually contemplating is eliminating the natural species of the planet, including the human species, in favor of one that they own the patent for. And so therefore they can legally, if in their mind this creator God actually exists as an entity that can present himself and say, what are you doing? They can say, well, what's the problem? All right. We own by right of creation like you owned by right of creation. And of course, I'm very optimistic that there are fail-safes in the natural way the world works, that means these people will be thwarted. But this concept of changing the human species to something that is not a natural part of the creation, this is what alchemy was all about. The alchemical traditions.
Transmogrifying
Yeah,
civilization and society into their image and after their likeness and how they want it to go. I guess part of the
yeah,
ancient transhuman ideology, I guess, the first attempt, I don't know if it's the first, but the monetary system to transmogrify not like necessarily, it's a different type of trans because you're going to you're moving society into a different path.
yeah.
No
You're
transmog
taking to a different set of laws. All right. So transhumanism is challenging natural law. All right. Natural biological law. That's what transhumanism.
is this their new Tower of Babel moment that they're trying to push?
It's part of it. To me, the Tower of Babel is specifically the financial system.
Okay.
I make the argument in my book that the Tower of Babel, which is actually a tower within the city, if you read the biblical accounts and even other accounts, but there are only about two or three accounts of Babel, and the famous one is in the Bible. And everybody talks about the Tower of Babel, but it's actually the city of Babel that is being referred to there. The tower is the governing set of laws. All right. So in the same way that we put judges on a high when we go into court and you look up to them and so on, all right. This is how people viewed the law because everybody looked at the original lawgiver in the northern realms, celestial realms. That's where the city of the gods was up there, and they tried to bring that configuration of planets, that brought about the golden age. They tried to bring the idea of that to Earth, the city of God being manifested in the Earth. And so judges,
Almost like looking at the apotheosis of George Washington in the I think it's the Capitol
yes,
building.
all that kind of
You
thing
know,
is exactly
he's in
based. Yeah,
you're looking up into the clouds of George
yeah,
Washington on a throne.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
We look into the skies because of that race memory of looking to the north. When your entire existence is dependent on what that group of planets is doing up in the north celestial realms, and things go really bad as well, and so you develop a habit for, well, the authority of whether I live or die lives up there, is up there. It's, and that's why we place kings up high. It's why we place judges up high. It's why we place people on pedestals when we give them authority over us in a way to act. Now, the Tower of Babel was precisely that. It was an authority that sought to replace the city or the abode of the gods that Saturn had represented when it was in, think about that's where the laws came from according to what they experienced. It was revealed to them with the let there be light moment. It existed in those northern realms, and they were building an authority to challenge that particular authority. In other words, they decided that they were going to do something that was not part of the golden age concept of weights and measures and laws. And what is fundamental to the Babel story, which is also reiterated when Babylon set up a golden statue, is they created a financial system based on gold and based on interest or usury. All
usury.
right. Yeah. So this became the method by which they could control the masses, and it starts with the temples, the priesthoods that came out of the Silver Age. These are the guys who, uh, you know, essentially the original Melchizedekian idea of a welfare system is that when you harvest something from the earth, 10% goes into a central place for people who are who are poor to be able to access that 10% of what you harvest. You keep and do what you like with the other 90%. So the temple becomes the repository for that 10% that you harvest, mine or hunt, whatever it is that comes out of the land, that you farm or you cultivate or you fish from, whatever. It goes into that temple. Then they hit upon the idea that you could also give a monetary worth of that 10%, but it had to be 13% in worth. So for most people, it was silver. So you gave your silver into the temple, and the temple collected the silver, which was supposed to be used for the benefit of people, orphans, widows, all that sort of stuff. But what starts is that they realize they can lend out against that silver using receipts. It's called a banknote. It's called a dollar bill in today's monetary thing. And they realized that for every ounce of silver, if one note was meant to represent 1 ounce of silver, they could lend out 2. They could lend out 3. They could lend out 30. They could lend out 3,000 of them, because nobody would come for the silver. They'd use the bits of paper to work amongst themselves. And then that's the gold, or the fractional reserve system, that was established in Babylon. But then they got greedy and they said, okay, we're lending you out these banknotes, but when it comes back, we want an increase. You have to pay interest. And this is why interest is reviled in virtually every major world religion as one of the great abominations, of the human species, because you are asking people, you're saying to them, I'm giving you 10 of these, and at the end of the year, I want 11 back. But there's only 10 of these things. And if you try to create an 11th one by printing one yourself, we'll kill you. We'll call that counterfeiting. But I still want that 11th piece of paper. It doesn't exist. And when you can't come back, when somebody loses out, as somebody always does, because there just isn't that 11th bit of paper or clay token or whatever it is they use, shell, whatever it is, that can't be whatever, the lender says, great, I now own everything that you produced. I own everything you own. I get to get your stuff, all right? And this builds in a society. It takes about 70 years or so. And it builds to a point where it becomes unsustainable. And this is why it was considered to be an evil form. And when people got trapped in all this sort of thing, the ancients had what they called jubilee systems and so on. You'll hear Trump and all these people start talking about that. It's one of the reasons they're getting to talk about getting rid of the IRS and the Federal Reserve. This is good stuff, in my opinion. How it's going to be replaced is the key to what's going down. Getting back to what you were saying about Trump and such before. But that system that Babylon started, where they had based on gold and they lent out with interest and so on like that, it's that system that keeps rearing its head. It moved from there to Jerusalem. From Jerusalem, it moved to Rome. From Rome, it moved to Venice. From Venice, it moved to Amsterdam. And today it sits in the city of London. And it controls the Federal Reserve, and it controls all the major central banks. It is a malevolent entity. It's an egregore of merchant bankers thinking. It's the way they think, and so on. This idea that we can own what you produce, we can have control over your productivity by simply lending you something and calling it a debt that you can't pay back.
And then, since we're on the money topic, so I was thinking, earlier in the show, you were talking about the serpent, the Garden of Eden. What is it? I know I interviewed William Bramley back in the day. Yeah. I think he called it the Brotherhood of the Snake. I don't know if that has connections with the Saturn death cult or whatever. But 100%. What is it with the serpent? Because we had the caduceus, the medical industry, the serpents wrapped around the staff. It's on the Blue Cross Blue Shield, the insurance logo. And you're talking about money. Yeah. What's the money sign? It's an S with a staff.
Snake, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's a snake, a serpent with a staff.
Well, I'm currently.
What's the connection there, man?
Okay, well, I'm currently working on a book called The Snake Gods of Atlantis, which looks into the transhumanism stuff that we were talking about and so on. But to put the cart before the horse in this argument so people know where I'm going from a biblical perspective, serpent worship is the idea that human beings can attain immortality that was lost by Adam through their own means, not through God. All right, so if you go to Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, you will see that the Elohim, representative of the creator God, archetype, says that they have to shut up what's called the tree of life, because if they can access that, they will be like us, being immortal and such, all right? And this is why you get rhetorical societies, debating societies that operate on the concept of rhetoric. They teach rhetoric, which is really just another way of saying life is about life is about persuading people. It's not about truth. It's about persuading them that you're right about something, irrespective of the truth. We see it in our justice system all the time, all around the world. And so that's why you get societies like Skull and Bones. They'll take 322. It's a reference to that point that supposedly God is the God of the Bible, the archetype God of the Bible, is admitting that humans can actually achieve immortality without God. They have the capacity to become their own immortal beings. And this is, again, a major aspect of the transhumanist move, the idea of moving into an androgynous, self-maintaining species that just needs maintenance but can live forever, just keeps re-downloading itself, and all these sorts of ideas. This is what goes back to what was suggested in the Garden of Eden to Adam and Eve. Why to be a god in your own right allows you to then seek a way towards immortality without reference to God's way of doing things. The ability to say, this is how it's going to be done, this is how it's not going to be done, and such, and I decide that. And of course, this idea of becoming immortal, when I talk about a death cult, people think it's all about death and so on. It's not. It's actually, it's a culture that's obsessed with immortality, which means they're obsessed with their own potential death and such. And they want to thwart death at the expense of everybody else so that they have an immortality. Now, snake worship, the reason that you get snake worship, it's one of the 7, don't ask me to list them off because there are 7 sort of mystery schools of thought from the ancient times and such. There's sex worship, there's fertility worship, there's fire worship, there's water worship, there's a number of other things, but serpent worship is one of the most profound and one of the most ancient. All right. And when you look at the biblical account, and we talk about a talking snake, that has always made people laugh, that the biblical account sort of seems a bit of a joke as a result. Michael Heiser, a scholar in Hebrew languages, he's very much of the opinion, and I agree with him 100%, that Eve was not approached by a snake as such. She was approached by a shining being. All right, think Illuminati, think about the illuminated ones that I talk about in my book, that kind of stuff. And it was this shining being that convinced her, you don't need God to be a god, to be immortal. You can be your own particular God in your own right, deciding for yourself what's right and wrong. And it's my opinion that this is another human being. That Adam and Eve are not the first people walking the face of the earth. They're coming into contact. That in fact, the trees of the Garden of Eden are representative of families and nations. And we see this in the book of Ezekiel. They make reference to, Assyria, the Assyrian being a mighty cedar in the days of Eden, the Egyptian being there, and so on. So what we're really talking about is a particular family group, starting with this Adam and Eve characters, all right, who are given a relationship through not being created, but formed from the dust of the earth, dust being the symbolism for the general populace at large. And they are given a covenant where they are told, you will look after creation. It becomes what becomes known as a dominion mandate, not the sovereignty mandate, but the dominion mandate. And that's what they lose when they start going against God's laws. But there are other people, and there are other cultures, and there are other beings that are existent at that time. I'm not talking about angels. I'm talking about human beings. And we must surely know that this is the case, because when Cain kills his brother Abel, supposedly leaving only Cain and Adam and Eve as the only human beings on the planet, all right, Cain is given a mark. And everybody thinks this is a physical mark, something stenciled on him or something like that, birthmark. But it's not. It means to have a bounty, and we're told what the bounty is. Now, people can correct me what it was, but I think it was something like when Cain said, when I go out, people, will kill me. Who are these people? Is he talking about his sisters that supposedly might be existent? He's not talking about Seth. Seth hasn't been born yet, and Adam is the only other man there with Eve. So who are these people that want to kill Cain? And God says to Cain, I will give you a mark, and if anybody tries to even assault you or whatever, I will take 30 of them. I think it's 30, something like 12 score, something like that. All right. I will take a number of people. Well, immediately there, you're told that in these times, there are other human beings running around who found what Cain did to be reprehensible. But the reason Cain gets to go free is because the only witness to his crime was God himself. And by the laws of the Bible, you need two or more people to establish a crime. So Cain knew people would just take the vigilante aspect and come after him for doing what he did to Abel. But God protected him with a bounty. That bounty that is called the mark of Cain, and it's the same thing with the supposed mark of the beast, the 666 figure. It's a bounty, the beast being this horrendous financial system that is developed from Babylon up to modern ages, and that through the Rome at the time that the book was written, this beast system being linked back to the only other place in the Bible you see the number 666, which is that golden statue that the Babylonians set up. The measurements of that golden statue in terms of cubits is 666. All right. So when you're told that the beast, is a man with an image that it stands for a man, it should not be a man. It stands for man, a man-made system that is based on the original Babylonian system, of which our modern central banking system, I argue, is a direct descendant of, in terms of its ability to enslave people. So yeah, I don't know. Did I sort of, as far as the snake gods go?
You did, but it also made me think. So 50% of the population, we had Cain and then Seth eventually. So 50% of the population has a bounty, or 50% of the population today are descendants of either Cain or Seth. And
according to biblical stuff.
According
to church theology.
So that would mean that 50% of the population has this bounty on them, or a byproduct of the beast. It
would, in terms of Cain. It only applied to Cain. I'm making a comparison with the mark of the beast, because people think marks as in like a tattoo or a symbol or something like that. But in the biblical sense, a mark means a bounty. All right. And so the bounty that the beast system has on us is that we can't buy or sell unless we use their monetary system. All right. So when you have the mark in the forehead and you have the mark in the hand, the forehead stands for intellectual labor. The forearm stands for manual labor. These are the two forms of ways that we can earn money to then go and get what we need. I mean, it's so bad today that I can't take an ounce of gold to a supermarket and pay with an ounce of gold for a bunch of groceries and such like that.
What you just said, basically, we are, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to put words in your mouth, we are living in the beast system already.
Absolutely. And have done since the time of Babylon. All right. Because
it started with the bite of the bitten fruit, right?
No. As far as the beast system that would hold sway, which is a system that is, it's a system that, okay, so in biblical symbolism, to give people a quick rundown, beasts mean kingdoms. All right. When you see prophetical word, or when people are talking about a beast, they're talking about a kingdom. And kingdoms are governed by cities. All right. And a city represents a system. So Jerusalem is an old system. Old Jerusalem is an old system. The New Jerusalem is a system to come that supposedly is going to, put everything right. Babylon, ancient Babylon, was an old system. Mystery Babylon is that old system reborn in a later age that governs a particular kingdom, beast. All right. What is that beast kingdom? And so on. I would argue that it is collectively the Western world as such. I don't, because I argue that Adam and Eve were not the first human beings, that there were other human beings around before them, that even the guy who seduced Eve into taking of the forbidden fruit, as we like to sort of refer to it, and so on, that he would come from a group of people, a culture of people that had basically Gnostic views. In other words, in the biblical sense, Eve was the first Gnostic convert to the idea that mankind can be its own God. irrespective of what God does, that we have that capacity. And particularly if God would just leave us alone to get on with it, we can do it. And this is the Gnostic sort of idea. It's and why Christ saying, you know, I am the only way, why Christians saying Christ is the only way, is at odds with what these people would prefer people to you know, to believe. This is serpent worship, because the serpent is cast down to the earth to slither around, all right, meaning that the words, it all goes back to the logos and the words, all right, their words will always be a base thing. They won't have high spiritual meaning or content. They will always slither amongst the dust. The dust is the overall peoples of the earth, and so on, and they will slither around in these overall peoples of the earth and so on. But eventually the biblical narrative is that a Messiah who is on board with the Creator God will set people free from those concepts with the truth, with justice, with salvation is really what these what, you know, what we are talking about here when it comes to the Messianic concept, in competition with the Gnostic concept or the snake god concept. So that's what
It
serpent
also
worship
says
is.
in Numbers 21 verses 8 through 9, the Lord said to Moses, make a snake and put it on a pole.
Bronze.
Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. So
Mm,
Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole.
yeah,
Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, he lived.
yeah. Okay, so people can take that at what they see as face value, you know, that this is a bunch of people thinking that, you know, bronze statues and things like that can heal you from being bitten by a snake. You know, and they think these people are infested with a snake plague, poisonous snake plague.
Mm-hmm.
What I would
It's
tell
deeper
people is
than
that
that.
the deeper meaning to that
Yeah.
is that when the Israelites were in the wilderness, they were a terrible people when it came to supposedly behaving themselves towards the God that had rescued them from slavery. This is the biblical narrative, all right? And so there's all kinds of examples of them building golden calves and doing things that were illicit and so on and such. I would put it to you that the snake, the plague of snakes, is really the egregore or the demon of contrary to God thinking that started to manifest the very same things that were put into that were told to that were condemned to be slithering through the earth, the words of the serpent being the shining one in the Garden of Eden. It's those words that started to gain a foothold in the camp that they had with Moses and so on. And so when they put up the brass snake, and this, if you go, I think it's the Book of Kings, Second Kings, 13th, 14th chapter, something like that. One of the kings takes that particular statue and breaks it up to demonstrate to the Israelite people. And this is over 1,000 years later, to demonstrate to the people it's just a piece of metal shaped in a snake. So when they put the bronze snake up and such, all right, and they were being infected with serpent worship ideas that would have had the symbolism of the snake, because if you look at Moses and you look, there's a lot of snake stuff going on with when he came back to free the Israelites. You know, he's chucking down snakes, and this snake ate up all their snakes, and you know, because that form of thinking, that Gnostic thinking, had as its symbol the snake, which became the caduceus. It became all these things that we see. All right, and the bronze statue, the bronze figure that was placed up, was there to remind every Israelite when you hear these words, all right, that you don't need God to define for you what is right and wrong, that you can actually start thinking for yourself what is right and wrong. You need to only look at their symbol to see it's just a symbol. It's just something. It has no power. It has nothing. In other words, people who manifest their thinking based on that symbol and use that symbol as a form of authority, like most of the mages did in those days, including Moses when he first went back to Israel. It's telling them that this is a false image that has no actual power. The
It has
words,
I'm sorry, it has no
yeah,
power,
sure,
but the intention and beliefs of the elites give it power, correct? And
absolutely,
we feed
yeah,
into it, and it kind of and it draws
yeah.
upon this egregore type archetypal
Yeah. So if it
whatever.
takes hold, uh, uh, when we started this conversation, as I said, if you get a knowledge of where symbols come from mythology, what mythology actually is, how it applies to actual events, that it's all natural history. It's not fictional fairy tales with an occult, back door to something that is beyond our understanding unless you're initiated into something. All right. Okay. If you go back to that idea, then what's being said with the bronze snake and with Moses and so on is that their words are just words that do not have the power of the words of your God. All right, they don't stand up to the words of the God. It's just words that they use. And this is why I say that if you want to look for where the culture of the Saturn death cult is most manifest, look in the legal trade, look in the academia. They are absolutely infiltrated and inundated with people who do not believe in truth. They believe in being able to persuade you that what they're saying is the truth. And that's the fundamental difference. And I don't know if it's coming full around. This is what I'm saying snake worship is. Snake worship is the idea that we can argue our way into a position where we can persuade even God that we're right, that we do it. And it goes back to that idea of claiming to be a god by knowing what is right and wrong in one's own right, as opposed to what has been revealed through a divine origin.
Yes, and I'm trying to find my Time magazine. I don't know where it is. I have it somewhere, but it's from like 1990 something. Time
Mhm.
magazine. It's the health of modern medicine. Um, I like collecting older books and older magazines and things like that. But the health of modern medicine. This is like from the 90s of Time magazine, and it was the snake wrapped around a staff,
Mm.
or I believe it could have been the caduceus, but it had
Yeah,
a
comes in
green
two versions.
it had a
Yeah,
green serpent, you
that's
know,
right.
on the cover of Time magazine. The health of modern medicine, you know.
Yeah, and again, what area of science are you going to be most interested in if your objective is to find a form of immortality that cheats death in terms of our natural human existence? You are going to try and find medical um, ways. You are going to try and find a you're going to try and find the right drugs. This is what, the fountain of youth, the philosopher's stones, all this kind of stuff that comes from the alchemical traditions. This is why snake worship is actually most manifest in the medical industry. All right. And, the dollar with its symbol is also linked in there because the pharmaceutical industry, all right, is the most powerful industry after the banking industry in terms of controlling us. We live in a virtual pharmaceutical dictatorship. I argue that Sodom and Gomorrah of the Bible is actually the city system that is based on the drug world, the pharmaceutical, and it's by pharmaceuticals they've made the nations go mad. These are this latter mystery Babylon sort of idea that you get in the Bible, which is simply just a continuation of ideas that come from ancient times. But it is this idea that the pharmaceutical industry has the power to ultimately discover how to make human beings immortal without God. All right. And that's why you have a green snake and why you have green crosses. Um, in a lot of chemists, pharmacies, they use the green cross. Comes from the Order of Lazarus, a um, a medieval, a crusading order, heavily linked in with the Templars and people like that, infamously and so on. But green becomes the color of this kind of thinking. Uh, the alchemical tradition of we'll find a way to be immortal without you, Mr. Creator God.
So I want to have you back on so we can focus. We kind of touched a little bit more in more context to the discussion of your Saturn Death Cult book. And then when I get you back on, I want to discuss more of the modern day push for the golden age, transhumanism.
Right.
Man, because I want to make an entire show about that. Transhumanism, AI, you know, are there two factions at play? Is Trump good? Is he good trying to push like you said, there could be a good golden age, and then you have the bad golden age, like the Schwabs and World Economic Forum, the New World Order, whatever you want to call them, pushing the Great Reset, which that sounds like their type of golden age. You know, I really want to go down those avenues. But last question. So everybody listening, we will touch more on that in the next conversation for sure. That'll be probably the entire podcast. So, and I don't want to, this be the last question. So I want to mention it earlier, but I don't want to interrupt your flow. So let's go back to the Garden of Eden. Would we be in the state, and I'm not, and this could have been implanted, edited to make women demonized, you know, of Eve starting all of this. That could have been because men treated women very poorly over the centuries, you know.
I get what you're saying.
So that could have been edited. It could have been Adam. I don't know. It could have been man that did this, you know. But with her, if it was her biting the forbidden fruit, is that the mess? If that would have never taken place, will we have ever evolved into the monetary debt class society, this control grid we live in, all the chaos, wars, rumors of wars, the madness that goes on in the world today, and in the past 100 years and centuries, the craziness in the Middle East, all this turmoil, craziness in the world. If that would never have taken place in the Garden of Eden, the temptation, what kind of world would it be today, in your opinion? And this is where we'll leave off.
Well, you know, I see that in the context of the overall mythological record talking about a destruction of the Golden Age. So Eve's actions are actually the precursor for what destroys the biblical version of the Golden Age, which is the time of Eden, and humanity is cut off from that time. So associate the Garden
Did
of
the
Eden.
modern does the modern context though, does it act like a pendulum swing that kind of ricocheted off of that?
Absolutely, yeah. But what I was going to say is that yes, there is a direct response to that, and the reason that the woman is highlighted in this, in my opinion, is because it's the woman who will give birth to. How can I put this? Who's responsible? All right, ultimately for Adam and Eve getting the wrong idea and doing what they did.
According to the Bible, the serpent.
No, it's God. All right. It's God because he put that tree there in the first place. Now, under the biblical laws, if you have a hole in your property that people transverse and so on like that, and you do not fence it off and somebody falls into it, you are liable. All right. So think of the tree of knowledge of good and evil as that hole that God did not fence off. So according to God's laws, God is now responsible for bringing about a restitution for the harm that was caused by Adam and Eve literally falling into that hole, taking off that fruit that was not fenced off. And that's the reason that you get the Messianic concept of God coming to earth himself to fix it all, and why Eve, the woman, is highlighted because she's the one who will give birth. She gets all confused and thinks that Seth is going to be her Messianic deliverer, and they're going to get back to immortality as they, you know, as the mythology sort of talks about. Doesn't realize that this is going to go down through centuries of people being born into this particular line and so on. But it's because she is giving birth to the Messianic line. It starts with Eve, all right, down, and ultimately ends with Christ. If you take that if that's your idea of the messianic message of the Bible and such, you have a situation where what's really happening in the Bible is not that God is saying, you naughty, naughty people, you now have to sacrifice and do this and do that. God is actually saying, okay, things went bad. You're going to get a lot of experience out of all this, but I'm going to put it right. Now, you've probably heard Christians talk about the unforgivable sin. Okay. And they will talk about, oh, it's blaspheming the Holy Spirit and all this. Okay. But they're not really getting the whole idea of what the entire biblical, the reason you have this biblical story, this narrative for, is that God is saying, I'm going to fix this. And the unforgivable sin is to claim God can't fix it. All right. He's incapable of fixing it. Now, that's the biblical narrative. And there are people out there, yeah, the biblical God's rubbish. He can't fix anything, can't do anything, or whatever like that. And they'll go with that as an idea. Then there are other people who believe that God will fix it. They have all kinds of theology how he's going to do it. Different whether you're Catholics or even going into Islam and Judaism and so on like that. But God is going to fix it. In this way, and this is what humans have to do to be a part of the fix. But the central premise to it all is that the unforgivable sin is that God is incapable of fixing that which he essentially broke by putting the tree of life of good, tree of good and evil, into the garden for Adam and Eve to be seduced into partaking of. All right. Now, if you go back to what we're talking about with the transhumanists and all that sort of stuff, all right, the move towards transhumanism, the move towards a perfected humanity by technological means, by alchemical means, is exactly that idea that God messed up, we'll fix it. All right. That's essentially the conflict that is between the human. Forget about Satan's and all that sort of stuff, because a human can be Satan. Jesus Christ was, I can't remember, somebody was called Satan. Peter was called Satan at one point. His top disciple. Satan just simply means somebody in an adversarial situation.
My ex-girlfriend was Satan too.
And so what you have is really, you have God, humanity at war with the creator God in deciding how things are going to get fixed. That's really what is at the basis of this Saturn death cult culture that you have in the world, and why the transhumanist element is the most frightening aspect of it, because they cornered all the resources and all that sort of stuff, to be able to feed into that, to do the work and so on, and they're doing it. They're attempting to find a way of, essentially, the creator God can't fix it. We're here. We'll fix it. I.e., we are the new gods.
I like what you just did there, Troy. Here at the end of the show, I like what you just did there. You did a perfect segue of what our next conversation is going to be about. More in detail, more in depth conversation about transhumanism, AI, the modern day, Saturn death cult, what's going on in the current, with the current events and how all this relates, But I like what you did there, and also we're gonna be talking about that transhumanism, AI, modern day push for golden age, but also want to bring in some darker aspects also. Pedophilia, sex trafficking, human trafficking, and things like that.
Human sacrifice.
Yes. And maybe correlate some of the sacrificing towards with some of the biblical and or other mythological texts in the ancient past also.
Oh yeah, that's where you get into Moloch, and
yes,
we're very lucky because through the research of some people that we can talk about at that time, we now know that the Renaissance nobility was heavily involved in this. We have the documented proof, and because everybody says, where's your proof for it? We've got the archaeological proof. Now we've got documented proof from the Renaissance, which gives you a direct connection between the elites of today with the elites of the Canaanites and the Babylonians and the Israelites. The Israelites were some of the worst worshippers of Moloch that you could find. Many
Mhm.
of their kings were doing this kind of stuff. But yeah, be interesting.
Well, I don't always say this, but I do it to the researchers I respect very much. I salute you, my friend. It was a treat, honor, and privilege. And thank you very much. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Well, thank you. Without guys like you, I'm just a guy sitting in an office researching stuff. You guys help me get this stuff out. So yeah, thank you very much.